Okay, we're going to get started now. Good morning to some of you. I believe it's afternoon. Welcome to today's BSMA webinar titled A Strategic Priority for Supply Chain Leaders, Managed Access Programs. Wanted to go over a couple housekeeping things for the audience. First, the chat feature has been disabled. If you have a question for any of the panelists, which, by the way, time is being set aside towards the end of this event. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A box. If you don't see it, then under More, if you click on that, you will also see Q&A. So if you have a question, simply type it into that box and and the panelists will be able to see the question and address them. Um, uh, that's a preferred method rather than hitting the raise hand. Um, Everybody who's registered for this event will receive a recording of it within a few days after the webinar. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tammy Bishop, co-founder and CEO of Acnos Pharma, who is the facilitator for today's webinar. Tammy?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce two exceptional leaders who are at the forefront of managed access and expanded access programs, Karen Frisello and Romina Oxborough. Romina is the CEO of Maprium, where she is focused on redefining how pharma delivers access to medicines globally, with her deep expertise across managed access, compassionate use, and early access strategy. Karen brings extensive leadership in expanded access and medical affairs, with a strong focus on enabling patients to access therapies outside of traditional commercial pathways. Together, they've been actively shaping the conversation around how managed access programs evolve from operational, often fragmented efforts into a more structured and strategic part of the global access infrastructure. What makes their perspective especially valuable is their ability to balance two critical priorities: expanding patient access to life-changing therapies while navigating the complex regulatory, ethical, and data considerations that come with it. So today, Karen will introduce the fundamentals of managed access programs, and Romina will discuss key considerations to implement an effective program, as well as having them take your questions after the presentations. So with that, I'll let Karen take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tammy, and thank you everyone for joining today. Romina and I are very excited to introduce a very fascinating topic, one that we've been involved in for a number of years, and one that often is lesser known amongst clinical supply professionals. Today, I will speak to some of the fundamentals and certainly hope to provide a foundational understanding that we can build on through the course of this webinar. Next slide, please. Firstly, I have to state, obviously, due to my current role within Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, that these views and opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of my employer, its affiliates, or any other organizations of which I'm associated. Next slide. So we're going to start with what is a managed access program? These are the basic tenets of a program in that they are programs that provide a legal pathway for access to investigational medicines outside of the clinical trial and commercial setting. These pathways are leveraged when there is no satisfactory treatment for a patient. These patients are also patients that have limited to no options because they, for example, cannot participate in clinical trials, or perhaps the clinical trials are not enrolling and or running in their home country. Now, certainly because the medicines are investigational and this is outside of a controlled clinical environment, the potential benefit must justify the potential risk. Next slide. What is very, very tricky for individuals that have not been exposed to these programs extensively is the nomenclature. Each country gets to select and name this particular program and or regulatory pathway. So it does trip people up quite a bit. For example, we are calling this a very broad-based generic term of managed access programs. However, if you dig into the regulation, the countries such as the US have a regulation that is called expanded access regulation. It sits in 21 CFR Part 11, which also, as you know, involves clinical trials. In the EU, broadly, these programs are referred to as compassionate use programs. But when you dig through each country, they may have a wholly different name. For example, Belgium, there is a medical need program, MNP. And the UK has something called an EAMS, Early Access to Medicine Scheme. So, as you can see, each country evolves its own regulatory guidelines and names these pathways. Canada is an SAP, Special Access Program, while Australia calls this a Special Access Scheme. And Japan, in fact, calls access outside of a clinical trial an expanded access trial. Next slide. So despite that, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, despite the naming convention, they all point to allowing access for patients with unmet medical needs prior to the drug being commercially available to them. Now, who's involved in these very important programs? Well, obviously the treating physicians. At the forefront, they are determining that the patient has an unmet medical need that cannot be met in that country by commercial products or enrolling clinical trials. So they're the first to actually request access. Technically, they would go to a sponsor company and or manufacturer and ask about broadly compassionate use for my patient who has a high unmet medical need. Now, the role of the regulatory authority, of course, is to oversee in that country and allow for these pathways to exist and to operate on a routine basis. In some cases, they must approve each and every individual request, or in other cases where there are multiple regulatory pathways within a country, like Belgium is a good one, or France, a sponsor company submits for an entire program, which a health authority approves, and then physicians can begin to enroll patients. The internal company teams are very critical to ensuring a successful and well thought out program. Obviously, they wouldn't just immediately respond, but rather they are probably thinking about a program if they are in areas of high unmet need, such as oncology, autoimmune, and certainly rare disease. These programs are owned by medical. The medical folks at the end of the day are the ones that play the biggest role in the strategic design of a program, where they will allow access, under what conditions, and in what method, and for how long. And ultimately, when the program's up and running, they will be assessing the requests, or at minimum, setting a standardized eligibility of which these requests are put up against. Within a sponsor company, legal and regulatory also play a very important role. Before a program would ever come to fruition, they would be assessing risk, and they would be assessing the regulatory pathway that makes the most sense to allow access in this environment. Now, of course, as we're focused on the clinical supplies teams, they play a critical role when the programs are not only in setup, in anticipating supply and labeling of that specific supply, but also providing that supply to be shipped to these patients as they are approved. So these are just the core stakeholders. Certainly quality, compliance, other certain stakeholders within your organization will have a hand in this. Next slide. So where do these programs fit in? If you think about the continuum of drug discovery through clinical trials, through approvals, and then finally commercial use, they sit really between that area of clinical studies, approvals, and actual commercial availability via launch. These act as a bridge to supply patients with unmet medical needs until which a time that medicine is commercially available in their home country. So these programs, depending on the level of need, the level of demand, and the willingness of a company, could start after phase 2. A company would want sufficient safety and efficacy data to allow the use of their product outside of a controlled clinical trial. However, I will say that more commonly we see these programs starting in and around phase 3, when there is sufficient evidence that there is a path forward to commercial. And that's really a very strategic decision. It is very case by case, depending on the therapeutic area and the level of need. If there are other medicines that could meet the needs of patients, or in the case of rare and ultra rare, where there's absolutely no treatment, these might be much more elevated in terms of a company deciding to do this a little bit earlier. It's important to understand that these programs typically sit in place and sponsor companies continue to provide supply for a number of years. As we all know, the US is a very short runway from submission to approval generally. But in Europe, there could be submission and approval by EMA, but it could be 24 months before you can land on an approved commercial price in countries like Belgium, Italy, Austria. And for that reason, these patients that simply cannot wait are provided this fantastic opportunity to access a novel, innovative, groundbreaking medicine until which a time it is commercially available and launched in their home country. And frankly, some of these programs in parts of Asia, for example, or Middle East, some of these access programs can go on for years. For example, a company may not have a filing plan yet for Malaysia or Singapore, yet they know there are patients there that can benefit and they are willing to make their medicine available. Generally, these are programs that are free of charge drug supply until commercial availability, but there are opportunities, should a company wish to do so, to charge. Next slide. So there's really two pathways that are important to generally understand. There are individual patients that can be brought forward by a physician who acts as the sponsor. In this instance, the pharma company is simply agreeing to make their drug available under certain terms and conditions, but they do not act as the sponsor. That physician is making an application to the health authority to ensure that they are permitted to supply and treat patient with what would be an investigational drug. The reporting is not very heavy in this instance. I'm not sure what happened to the slide. It became very small. Do we know if we can bring that back up? I'm not sure what happened here, but I'm not able to quite, there we go. Thank you very much. With regards to a physician acting as the sponsor, there's minimal submission requirements. It may require that this drug is already available in some markets, such as the United States, before this individual route can be used. In this case, because often these are emergency requests or very urgent requests, the labeling requirements are very broad and a lot more loose, let's say. So it may very well be that whatever drug supply is available, the health authority will allow it to be used in the case of a patient with an urgent need. Now, on the other side of this are the much more structured programs, for example, group programs in the United States or in Italy or Belgium or France. Actually, those are planned for well in advance. They're a very strategic move by the company to actually act as the sponsor, submit to the health authority for the overall program with a protocol generally. And once the health authority approves this group's program, the physicians can then begin to enroll patients. It's much more formal. You're exposing many more patients, and therefore there are reporting requirements. There's an extensive submission process, and it actually may be mandatory. In some countries, you don't have the chance or the opportunity as a manufacturer to allow individual case by case patients. Rather, the only way to provide early access would be through a group program where you act as the sponsor. In these cases, generally, there are specific labeling requirements agreed to in advance by the health authority. Hence the reason it's so important that a company starts to look at these typically 12 months prior to wanting the go live of a program, because there's a lot of planning involved. And as you would all know, the timelines, the lead times, I should say, for providing supply, having it labeled appropriately can be several months, in fact, if not longer. Next slide. So these programs are access. They're for treatment and access as opposed to clinical trials, which are set forth for research and to answer scientific questions. So obviously, clinical trials are sponsor-driven. Access programs can be very much physician-driven. Extensive monitoring in a trial, the only requirement in an access across all countries that have defined regulation for these access pathways is safety. That's an absolute, whether the physician is acting as a sponsor or the manufacturer. In a trial, lots and lots of data collection. In an access, it's much more limited. It could be very interesting because it's real world data, and many companies are quite interested to get a first glimpse into what is the use of my drug going to look like out in the real world. In trials, proactive patient recruitment, access programs, these are responses to unsolicited requests. In other words, you cannot in any way promote managed access programs. They have to happen and supplying to patients in need must be the result of an unsolicited request. Otherwise, it could look like you are promoting an unlicensed medicine to be used. And manufacturers are very careful about how they roll these out. In a clinical trial, typically, as you know, there's a fixed country list. However, in an access program, that could change. You could be, as a manufacturer sponsor, find that there's demand in a country that you didn't realize you would have. Maybe it's Finland. So you can add Finland into the mix if you would like. In a trial, you don't charge for product. In an access program, as stated, generally it's a bridge until commercial availability. So most companies will provide free of charge, but there is actually legal ability to charge for a product. And it's not done very commonly, but it can be in some unique situations. Next slide. I thought it would be important, since we largely have a US group of participants, to talk about the FDA. The FDA has very defined regulation here under their expanded access portion of 21 CFR Part 11. There are three actual pathways. So a company would probably have to decide which pathway makes the most sense. It's often defined by the amount of demand. For example, if you anticipate as a company you're operating in an ultra rare space where diagnosis is still difficult, it might be that you only get 10 requests over the course of 2 years. However, in other areas, even in rare disease or specifically in oncology, you might anticipate, in speaking with your KOLs, that if we had a if we had a managed access program available, it may be that they would bring hundreds of patients to the table in terms of those that could potentially benefit. And that would move you into moving towards an intermediate size patient population EAP or MAP. In that case, that is where the manufacturer becomes a sponsor and much more rigor. There's also a third pathway called a treatment IND, where you're actually opening up an arm of your IND specific and to this particular product. And those are very large populations. While FDA does not put numbers against these pathways, anecdotally, you would see, for example, individual patient access could be upwards of 30 to 50 individual patients over the lifetime of that program. Intermediate tends to be in the hundreds of patients, and treatment IND can be in the thousands, actually. Drug supply labeling for each of these pathways depend on the pathway that is going to be utilized to meet the needs of patients. And next slide. So supply considerations, very important. As supply chain professionals that we have joining today, it's really important that you're involved very early to understand if there's going to be a potential need. What could that forecast look like? How many vials or syringes or oral doses am I going to need to support a managed access program for 8 months, 1 year, 5 years, whatever it looks like? So it's important to understand the global demand, the map forecasting, allocation across countries. It could be that the US is going to have a lot of need and therefore need more supply than a small country where the product or the disease is not well known or developed yet, or where you did not have studies. So allocation across countries is a key piece as you're making decisions about supply, and certainly balancing the clinical trial supply versus the MAP supply. It's very important, obviously, that you have ample supply to support your clinical trials well over a MAP. And there are many instances where companies simply cannot conduct a MAP because they do not have enough supply outside of that is needed to complete their clinical studies. And again, the most important piece is the planning around country-specific labeling and the lead times to get label proofs, approvals, and then certainly the printing, labeling, and finishing of that drug supply and shipping to wherever it may be held, which could be within your own company, or it could be with a vendor, because many companies select a MAP vendor, a managed access program vendor, to manage the incoming requests and to distribute product and import it into each country that is involved in the program. And I think I'm on to my final slide. So for the key takeaways for MAPs, they provide access to medicines before approval and or commercial launch. They differ greatly from clinical trials. They are regulated in each country by health authorities, and the requirements vary greatly by country. So it's incredibly important that there is due diligence on the feasibility and what it will take across each country of interest if a company is interested to supply access to their medicine. And it requires very intense proactive planning, especially for supply, since that is not an aspect that a supply team wishes to be told they need in a short amount of time. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Romina.
Thank you, Karen. So hopefully you can hear me and see me okay. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going a step further. So Karen has done an excellent introduction, and hopefully you now have a solid grounding on what managed access programs are. You understand the nomenclature, you understand how it works. So I'll now expand onto three specific key themes. So how these programs operate in practice and what are the considerations you have to make. I'll expand a bit on real world data, so the data collection piece that Karen introduced, and how to make these programs controlled and compliant. So I always think about these programs through a number of core pillars. So the patient access piece, and Karen explained that really well, is absolutely at the core of these programs. They are essentially set up to provide treatment to patients, and that should never be forgotten. But of course, it's absolutely key that we run these programs in the right way. So being able to run a program efficiently from an operational and supply chain perspective is absolutely key to ensure that we provide that patient access. I'll talk about the real world data piece, which I think is really important. It's something I've been focusing on for many years, on how important this is. And of course, technology. Technology really ensures that all of these pieces come together and they can be delivered in the right way. So let's talk a little bit about data collection. Of course, as we've learned so far, these programs are not clinical trials, and the objective is to treat patients. However, whether you intentionally want to collect data or not, you are collecting that data as part of the supply, essentially, and the treatment for these patients, and ensuring that they're safe. So you're already collecting information about the patient's characteristics. So who are the patients that you're providing treatment to in terms of their eligibility, because you can set eligibility criteria for these programs. You're collecting safety information. The treating physicians have to provide safety details. You're collecting metrics, operational metrics of, how long it takes to supply, where the patients are, which countries you open these programs to, and what demand you had, but also about the indication, about the some of the key details that are happening as part of your program. You also get to know about the treatment patterns, the duration of treatment, what's happening to these patients. And what is key to remember is this is outside of clinical trials. So this is a real world population. And therefore, all of this information is absolutely key for you to have and understand more about this treatment and how you will behave in the commercial environment. And it's really interesting because when talking to pharma companies who are running these programs, sometimes they don't realize how much data they have been collecting. And one of the reasons why they don't realize it is because it's not all in one place, and it might be actually collected in a fragmented way. And we'll cover that a little bit more in one of my next slides. But why is it important to utilize the data that you have collected? It is key because you can use it to support regulatory interactions. And by that, what I mean, and I'm leaving that a bit vague, but in reality, we know that many companies provide data collecting as part of these programs as supportive information when doing a filing. And there are many cases where you can even look it up on the FDA website. I was doing that earlier today just to see what is out there in terms of labeling. And many companies do provide this as supportive information, especially in a rare disease space where the number of patients is actually not very big, not very large. It helps with reimbursement and pricing negotiations. And we know that this has happened many times. Of course, these conversations are confidential, so it's difficult to get clear examples. But we know that companies have had conversations in this respect because, again, they use this data and this evidence to support the use of the product. It can help inform clinical strategy. It can help you understand more about your patients and the patient population, maybe populations you haven't quite studied. And of course, sometimes these programs are used to provide access to children. And again, absolutely key to get to understand how what will be happening there. And it can help you with some forecasting. You understand a little bit more about where demand has come from, which countries maybe are more aware about that particular treatment. These programs are quite complex, I have to say. So they come with some challenges, like everything that is a bit complex. And one of those is the fragmentation that exists across countries' regulations. I think Karen gave very good examples about even within one country, there might be 2 or 3 different pathways that can be followed to provide access. And that is great because, of course, at the end of the day, the regulations exist so that the patients get access in a regulated way. However, having all of these different pathways creates complexity. Lack of standardized processes can create some challenges. And we have seen, it's really interesting. So I've started working in 2012, which is like a long time ago. And I can say I have seen the evolution of how pharma companies have developed processes and have centralized teams to manage these programs, and have created policies and SOPs and a whole set of pathways to be able to provide access in a very compliant and managed way. But that's not always the case. And this is one challenge I have seen time and time again that is absolutely important to overcome. Compliance and privacy constraints. We know different countries have different regulations, and that also creates some complexities. Of course, HCP and sites admin burden, and where that is absolutely critical is when, for example, they're asked to follow different processes for different treatments, or there are different platforms they have to log on in order to get access, or it's not clear for the sites what they actually need to do. So that can create complexities, as is the case with being reliant on manual tools or not having full visibility. And that goes back to the reality that you're collecting a lot of data, you're running one of these programs, but you might not have that visibility because it's all very fragmented. And how to overcome those challenges. I mean, I'm a big technology person. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think technology can really support. And my advice to companies is always to look at how to make things easier for yourselves. So reducing manual processes, but ensuring that everything is under one umbrella, that you are able to have full visibility and understanding of what's going on with your treatment, where it has, who you have supplied, where it has gone, what has happened there, what have the KPIs been, and making sure that all of the information is secure, that you are also being fair. And I think, and that's one thing that is absolutely key here, making sure that you have a standardized way of approaching any of the requests you have for treatment and the way you provide it, which will ensure fairness. One thing I wanted to touch upon, and it's very much linked to compliance and being able to provide, say, to provide have a regulated approach to what you're doing, and is how you mitigate risk that might come up from these programs. And again, picking on what Karen said, originally, these are not clinical trials, but of course, what is absolutely key is to highlight that clinical trials do have priority over these programs. If you think about supply, for example, your supply managers, your clinical trials are going to have priority in terms of treating those patients and collecting the data that you need for your approvals. You can have eligibility criteria as part of these programs so that you have control on who are the patients who receive access. Again, talking about supply, important to ring-fence some supply for a program. Once you start treating a patient, they should be able to complete all of their treatment, and you need to make sure that you are forecasting and you're understanding demand and that you have enough to supply all of those patients who at least have already started. Cross-functional governance, that's absolutely important. Make sure that all the teams that need to be involved are involved. So your regulatory team, your clinical team, quality, you might have an ethics team, so medical, they all need to be involved to understand how you're approaching these programs, to have clarity on the objective and how you're approaching these treatments. And of course, having the ability to have real-time monitoring of what's happening will allow you also to mitigate risk, because it allows you to see if there's anything that's not quite working as it should, and again, predict what happens in the near future. But what makes a managed access program successful? And I would say this is my last slide, and I'm hoping to bring everything a little bit together here. So I've talked about 4 pillars, which are, the patient access. So that is mirrored by, if you like, equity and fairness. So ensuring that you are providing fair access, that you are treating the request for access in the same way, that you're following a defined process. Then I had, operations as a key pillar, and indeed having clear governance and cross-functional alignment will allow you to run the operations in the right way for the type of program. Likewise, having compliant and robust processes underpinned by the right technology is absolutely important here. And another key successful factor is to have visibility of the data that you have collected, of the safety reporting that may have happened, and understand where your supply is and what you have available, and be able to do some forecasting. And maybe one point to conclude about data, because that's something that is always at my heart in these type of programs. What I've come to understand from talking to patient advocacy groups who are very familiar with these programs is that they feel it's a missed opportunity to not utilize the information that you may have collected in these type of programs, to support the future generation of patients and the ability to provide treatment more broadly. So this is my last slide. I am wondering if people have questions, so I'm going to maybe stop sharing the slides and allow for some questions to be asked.
We do have a couple of questions, Romina. They're asking, could you please advise when we say commercially available, does it limit it to a particular indication or unrestricted to the indication? Karen, do you want to answer that one? I'm guessing that's a Karen question.
Yes, sure. Well, companies are very strategic about what they will allow with their investigational medicine. So I would have to say that most of the time, a company is very focused on the key indication they are studying, and therefore will allow early access to patients for that particular indication. In the event that they have some data which points to other indications that they may not be pursuing, it's really a question of that company if they would allow use for an indication that they are not pursuing. So I will say generally 95% of the time, companies decide early on, if we're going to do an early access program, we will only allow for this indication that we are studying, or indications, plural. So that is usually how it works, because keep in mind, this is the bridge until which a time that drug is commercially launched for those indications they're pursuing. Not to say there aren't exceptions on an off chance of very low numbers, and if there is sufficient data by that company, they feel they have enough safety and efficacy data to make it available on a one-off for an indication they do not plan to pursue in the short term. On a case by cases, they may allow for it. I'm not sure if that answers. Hopefully it does.
I think it does. And we have another question. It says, we are ending our clinical trial and implementing a single patient protocol as needed globally. Once the trial ends and before the drug is approved for the single patient protocol, can I continue to give the patient clinical trial material to avoid a gap while waiting for approval? Want me to read that again?
I think I understand, but Romina, by all means, if you want to step in. Obviously, if the patient is still enrolled in the clinical study and they have visits left, indeed, you can continue to supply them under the protocol for the study. But once that study ends, typically you can't just send clinical trial supply under nothing. In other words, you either have to be under the clinical trial protocol or under an approved managed access pathway. But Romina, please add on.
Yeah, I think yes, and of course yes, I don't think I have much to add. If it's under a clinical trial, is definitely clinical trial supply. I am wondering if the question is when we talk about single patient protocol, if that's specific to the US or in general, you are essentially implementing a named patient approach around the world. So what kind of pack you can provide really depends a little bit on the country as well, and what type of regulations you follow. You can provide clinical trial supply in many cases if you don't have other pack available, but it really does depend on the country. Yeah, I'm not sure if we answered the question, but happy to have a follow-up question if that's not what you asked. Yeah.
Okay, now we have another one. How do you continuously track the regulatory relevant changes coming from CMC on a managed access program? Is this as closely controlled like a global clinical trial?
Yeah, really interesting question about regulations in general. So again, I'm wondering if you're asking about in general globally, or more specific about the US. But regulations, they don't change that often, but they do change. And the reality is not that straightforward to know all the regulations in all the countries, but typically your regulatory team should be monitoring for those. Each country has are they as tightly regulated, that's closely controlled? That's a good question. They are in a way, because in many countries they issue these regulations as part of their gazette or as part of a decree. So in Italy, for example, they have different decrees. So yes, they are very tightly controlled and they're issued and published, and you can find them in the websites of their agencies. In the FDA, there's a whole section called expanded access programs, and you can go and see all the regulations there. Again, the MHRA has a whole section, and so on. So I would say the answer is yes, they are very tightly controlled, like clinical trial regulations. How do you get to know that they changed? Is that environmental monitoring that needs to happen on a regular basis. I don't know, Karen, if you'd like to add to
We have
that.
another question. We've got lots of them here. All right. How do you typically organize the supply chain for EAP or expanded access programs, central versus decentral in country?
I'm happy to take that, Romina.
Yeah.
It really depends on how you're going to implement a program. For example, many companies will partner with a map provider. There's a number of map providers, and their expertise is understanding the specific import requirements for medicines into hundreds of countries, if you will. So if you are going to partner, generally, you are going to prepare supply appropriately, labeled appropriately, and you're going to ship it to their depot, which could be, or depots, could be they keep some of your drug in the US, some in Ireland, some in the UK, some in Asia, for example, to then further respond to requests and import as applicable from those kind of starting bases that they hold drug. Now, if you choose to do your own programs and you're going to be shipping and working through the import processes without a partner, then generally it's kept centrally, and then on sort of an ad hoc basis, it is then the supply shipment is initiated. That's simply because you don't know exactly when you're going to get a request, what country it's going to be from. So to put product supply in specific countries in bulk, first of all, involves complexity because you're going to be asking to import bulk supply of unlicensed drug, which is not easy. It's better to hold it centrally in your depots, wherever those may be, and then in a response to a validated request that is approved, not only by your company, but approved by the health authority, you can then further ship from one of those depots. So it's kind of a centralized concept. Romina, maybe I'd like to ask if you have seen this differently.
No, I have seen the same. I would say it also, as usually we are, and we love always answering the question, it depends, as an answer, it depends, because it does depend a little bit also on the number of patients you would expect, for example, right? So how few patients you expect, or whether you expect, you know that you're going to get, for example, many patients in Europe, then yes, you may want to base some supply in one of the countries in Europe, because then that's easier, that's quicker to ship. So it really does depend a little bit on the geographic expectations of the program.
Okay. So another question is, who is responsible in organizations for these programs?
Ha. That's a really good. Maybe I'll start, Karen, that's okay, and then you can add to that. I have seen a big some changes in these. When I think I mentioned I started working in this space for a long time, sometimes it used to sit with clinical operations as people who the team who were trying to work out how to manage patients coming out of the clinical study, or how to manage demand. Um, Today, I would say that has evolved quite significantly, and many companies have set up specific managed access program teams. They tend to sit under medical affairs, I've seen. And in terms of responsibility, typically I would say that sits with those people. However, I think when I talked about governance, I was talking about having a cross-functional team, because, of course, responsibility might sit with medical affairs, but you need to ensure that you have all of the stakeholders involved in, defining how they are going to be governed. So you do need a number of different people involved.
Okay, and then it's saying any specific experience with managed access programs when you have in-licensed or acquired the drug.
I mean, I will just say this is not terribly uncommon, particularly when large companies are now purchasing smaller biotechs that may have one drug, one asset. If you're a big pharma company, you're probably going to initially allow those to continue, but certainly investigate if they're going well, if there are challenges, if there are barriers, and understand. But I think over time, larger companies tend to adopt their own processes and move those under their own umbrella of access. They probably wouldn't do it right away because this disruption is a huge risk in these programs. You never want to put a patient at risk to miss a dose, for example. Now, if you're a smaller company and you acquire, I have often seen where they allow the person that's overseeing this and perhaps the map vendor that is actually distributing drug globally to really continue. If it's working well, they don't disrupt it per se, but rather allow it to continue for as long as it's necessary.
Very good. And then I've got some more questions popping up here. Can you develop and comment on the packaging requirements for managed access program, the language and translation requirements? This is a big question.
Mm.
Yeah. And the use of so-called international packaging, using English as the language on the product labeling. So Karen, I guess that's a you question because you were sort of
Yeah, I've
in
been
the
through
weeds of
many,
these
many
programs.
maps since in the last 7+ years with my current company. I've initiated 6 of these, and they're all different. It's largely in the rare disease space. But that being said, the first step is to conduct a thorough feasibility on a per country basis where the company intends to allow their medicines to be accessed early prior to commercial availability. Each country sets forth their guidelines depending on the stage of drug. For example, if there is no commercial pack, then it could very well be that you have to create a clinical pack of your own that says, for example, all of the typical Annex 13 requirements, but also says for compassionate use only. So that's going to be really, really important that you, either within your company or if you partner with a MAP vendor, they should be conducting thorough research on what label is permitted based on where the drug is in development and the pathway you intend to use. Generally, in the group programs, so let's say Germany, Belgium, France, even Italy, there will be very defined requirements on a label. So it could be that you are producing 2 or 3 different types of labels, maybe even more, to essentially support your map. In some cases, again, depending on the country, you might be able to use what we call a generic English label that is most widely accepted, that has the basic attributes that a label requires, and that in fact can be used across many countries. It's quite acceptable, particularly as you get outside of US and Europe, Asia, Middle East, are just happy to have drug at the end of the day. So they're not as particular and not as the requirements aren't as heavy as you might see in each individual European country and or US.
And that leads to the next question. How does one forecast the demand for these programs and and get this all labeled up and ready to go? So how is that done?
I mean, there are different ways of doing this. And again, Karen, I know you have a lot of examples there, but I mean, you can use if you like, your typical methodology of saying, well, like, what's the prevalence, and make some assumptions and do that. You can also talk to your colleagues, depends on whether you're a big company or a small company. Talk to your colleagues in the different countries because they tend to have a good understanding of what demand is going to be. You can also talk to your clinical sites that you have used in different countries and understand more there what their expectation is. So the different approaches of doing these. It will also depend a little bit if you provide access as a free of charge product or if you are going to charge, that will have a different expectation in terms of demand. I know, Karen, you have also some
Yes.
examples here that you have used. Yeah.
It's multifaceted. You may have your teams look at the epidemiology, the prevalence, but at the end of the day, we've had great success if you have medical representation in these countries, or perhaps global medical directors in some cases, to speak to your KOLs and speak to your PIs. If we were to bring this product forward, theoretically, if we were to start a map for this product, for this indication, what kind of patients numbers would you see annually within your realm or your institution that would be eligible and you would want to put forward? I know it seems like sort of putting a finger in the air and guessing, but that combined with prevalence and such is really helpful. I will add the caveat that these programs, while you may have some pretty robust numbers when you look at prevalence, epidemiology, there are many, many hurdles for that patient to get through all of those barriers and happen to be at the right institution at the right time with a very informed KOL or physician to make it the leap from unmet medical need to actually receiving. So the numbers really are much, much smaller than you would ever anticipate, to be honest.
All right, so we have another question here. Would you recommend a company utilize a managed access program vendor versus managing the program internally within the company without a vendor?
This is a really interesting question. I love this question. So I would say, obviously, if you're managing these programs internally, you will have a lot more control about how you're running them. I think the issue is, of course, having the expertise that you might not have the expertise, regulatory expertise. You might not have the supply chain expertise, the labeling that Karen mentioned. You might not have the ability to store in different parts of the world. But it's a really interesting question because it used to be the
A bigger
case.
company? A bigger company could do this internally. A bigger company could do it
Yes,
internally.
and this is
Qualify
what we have
to be the vendor.
what we have seen. And it used to be the case that companies would go out to vendors straight away. But I have seen a shift into taking these programs in-house a lot more, especially especially big pharma, where they want to have that control. I mean, obviously, I am an advocate of having that more control, and having technology that supports you to do that internally. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what I do. But of course, you also need to be cognizant that you might not have all of the expertise internally, and if you are a small company, it's more likely that you will need help. Yes,
Very good.
I think we're close to time,
I
aren't
don't
we?
have any other questions. We are right at the top of the hour. Is there anything else anybody has to add or to conclude with?
Tammy, I do see one more question, which is a quick and
Oh.
pretty easy answer, is really someone's asking, should you allow your commercial distributor to come in early and manage the EAP supply to ensure a smooth transition? And I will say that in theory, that sounds perfect. That way there's no disruption to the supply source. But unfortunately, a lot of commercial distributors, they really don't come into the realm of managed access, and they may not understand how to get an unlicensed product imported into a country. You'd have to really dig in and see if they have expertise in that arena or not, in terms of making a decision whether to allow for that.
Very good. All right, let me just double check one more time. I don't see any other questions. I think,
Yeah, I'll take it over then, Tammy. Thank you.
okay, thanks, Bill.
So I wanted to close with 2 points. One is, can everyone in the audience find their Q&A tab and indicate in that whether or not you have an interest in another session regarding managed access programs, and if there's anything more specific within that topic that you would like to hear more information on. So again, please express your desires in that. Second, for those of you who may not have been on the call in the first minute, I wanted to remind everybody that anybody who registered for this event will be sent a recording of it sometime within the next week. And last but not least, I wanted to thank Tammy, Karen, and Romina for a very educational and informative topic. And on behalf of BSMA, I'd like to thank you, and again, thank the audience for attending. Okay, without any further ado, then we're going to sign off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone.
Bye.